Sometimes Jesus tells us parables that, even with some explanation, are hard to get our minds around. Other times, his parables are so straightforward that we get them right away, even without any explanation. Today's parables seem a little more like the easy ones. If you have a seed, it grows into something bigger, and then you get fruit. We can recognize right away that the seed is God's message. It then grows into something bigger through us, and if we do that well, then it will bear fruit, and the most important fruit is always heaven. I realized this meant that I could preach about the seed. I could talk about how we jump into God's word, read the Bible more, read the readings more, do Lectio Divina, and so on. Or I could talk about how we help the branches grow, how we tend the soil to help the seed, that we grow through personal prayer and adoration and faith groups, etc. But when we do these things, then we are on the path to get to heaven, which of course is good, right? But what about that last step? What about this fruit? What about heaven? Heaven seems pretty straightforward, I think, to us. If you get that heaven is the end goal, and if getting there gives you all the motivation that you need to do the Christian life, then that's great. Keep listening to God's word and keep tending your soil. However, in my experience in talking to others about the faith, the concept of heaven is not always straightforward. I taught religion at Subiaco Academy for 4 years, and one day in class I was talking about heaven as the heavenly liturgy, and one of his students was brave enough to raise his hand and say, "But Mass is boring. Why would I want to do that for all eternity?" And that's probably not an uncommon assessment, because we've all probably been to a Mass that bored us. Now, not this Mass, of course, but some other Mass. The standard depiction of sitting on clouds and playing harps isn't much better. That might make an interesting first impression, but doing that for all eternity is not going to thrill us. The TV show The Simpsons once had a bit where they showed Catholic heaven and Protestant heaven, and we'll just say they made Catholic heaven look a lot more fun, but even that still falls way short of what heaven actually is, because there is nothing on earth that we would want to do forever. We can eventually tire even of our favorite activities. So what are we left with? It's hard to be motivated to receive God's seed and till the soil for it to grow if we don't care about the fruit. Again, if you have a good idea of heaven that works for you, great. But I expect that there are many of us here today that have not really thought about heaven. Or if you have not always been that impressed with the depictions you have seen. And so let's work on that today. So first, we have to say that any concept we can come up with about heaven will fall short of the reality that is heaven. Right now, we can only deal with earthly terms, and earthly terms are limited in ways that heaven is not. Basically, if we come up with an image of heaven that we like, we have to know that heaven is infinitely better than even our best idea. St. Anselm famously defined God as that greater than which nothing can be thought. Heaven is like that too. If we can imagine it on earth, heaven is something even better. So we have to do our best today with human terms. So maybe you've experienced a story, maybe a book or a movie where the characters have encountered a world full of portals. Each portal leads them to a new world. They are surrounded by whole worlds that interest them and call out to them. And in the stories, our imaginations can go with them to these amazing, fantastical places. Places that make us thrilled and curious. Places that we can't take in at first glance and we want to explore endlessly. No matter how much time we spend there, we could never experience it all. They contain whole worlds. Heaven is something kind of like that, maybe. If we can let our imaginations explore it properly, then we will never be exhausted. You may say that portals in a story are one thing, but what about real life? We don't have portals in real life. So let's think about it this way. I remember being a child, and my family would have friends come over. And my friends and I would play with all kinds of toys, trucks and balls and Legos and Transformers. And while we played, our parents sat in the other room and just talked. That other room was a portal for us to see a new world, a portal into the world of being an adult. And I might have vowed that when I grew up, I will keep playing with my toys because that other world looks boring. As I've matured, I realize that adult world is not, that adult conversation can lead to all kinds of fantastical, inexhaustible places. Heaven contains far more than we can imagine it does because our imaginations are limited by the world we live in, just like my childhood imagination was limited by being a child. The Mass is one of those portals into another world also. The Mass is our little heaven on earth. Now notice I didn't say the Mass always feels like heaven on earth. The Mass is our little heaven on earth. My old students have it right, even if they didn't know they had it right. The moments of the Mass are inexhaustible. Just as you and your adult friends can talk for hours about world affairs while your kids in the other room think it is unbearably boring, any aspect of the Mass can capture us for hours if we let it. When our second grade students were preparing for First Communion a month ago, I brought them here into the church one day to talk about the Mass. Now, during the Mass, it takes me, as a deacon, about 2 minutes to get the altar set up at offertory. But talking to those second graders that day, I spent about 20 minutes talking about those 2 minutes of the Mass, the prayers that I say, why I do the things that I do. And they were engaged and retained it when I asked them about it afterwards. There is great depth in every moment of the Mass if we can allow our thoughts to mature and to see it in eternal terms, rather than with eyes conditioned by our ever-changing world. The Mass is a personal connection to a personal God. The Mass is a friend, maybe a friend you have lost contact with, kind of like we sometimes lose contact with God between the Sundays. A friend who invites you to dinner to sit around his table and catch up. Oh, and everyone who's ever mattered to us in our lives is invited also. At some point during that meal, one of us or all of us is going to say, we should do this again more often. We shouldn't wait so long to catch up. We know that's true because we've all been in those situations. So let's not wait until next Sunday to connect with our God or connect spiritually with our friends and our families. Certainly, let's not try to wait until heaven to make those connections. Yes, the Mass can feel boring at times. The same way anything we don't understand but have to do for a long period of time is boring. A few months ago, I happened upon a game of cricket in a park. I watched for a few minutes, and the longer I watched, the more lost I became. Cricket is boring to me. But I know that cricket is one of the most exciting things in the world to millions of people. The problem isn't cricket. The problem is that my understanding of cricket is limited. And if I was willing to let my imagination explore it, I could find depths and beauty and excitement that I can't see right now. I'm like that farmer in the gospel, watching his field and seeing nothing happen. Talk about boring, watching an empty field. But he knows that he can't fathom the things that are happening beneath the soil, and he can't wait to experience it. Today, I challenge you to pick a single moment of the Mass and dive into it. Don't try to get your head and your heart around the whole Mass right away. Pick one moment. What does it mean that we carry bread and wine and money from the back of church to the front of church? What are the priest and the deacon doing when they purify the vessels after communion? What is the priest talking about in that prayer that he says after communion? Get online later and look up that prayer, or the prayer that I say when I pour water into the wine, or reread one of the readings. You can spend your entire prayer time for the coming week diving into just those one single moment. Let your imagination explore the Mass, because the Mass is a glimpse of heaven. Better yet, each moment of the Mass is an individual, inexhaustible glimpse of heaven. Each moment is a mustard seed, and heaven is greater than anything we can possibly imagine in this world. When we think we understand heaven, think about how much better it is than even that. There is room in its branches for all the billions of us that have ever existed. As our second reading says, we walk by faith, not by sight. The joy and the beauty that awaits us on this altar and throughout this entire liturgy is more than we can ask or imagine. And it is only a momentary taste of what awaits us in the eternal banquet with God.